In December 1945, Europe was silent in a way it had never been before. The thunder of artillery had ceased, the columns of refugees had slowed, and the once invincible Wehrmacht was in ruins. Yet amid the rubble of the old world, one man found no peace. General George S. Patton, the warrior who had driven the Third Army across Europe faster than any army in history. The war had made him a legend, but peace would make him restless, frustrated, and, some would later whisper, dangerous. Patton was stationed in Bavaria, commanding the US Third Army's post-war occupation zone. His task, dictated by the newly formed Allied Control Council, was to oversee denazification, reconstruction, and the management of millions of displaced persons. It was a role ill-suited to his temperament. Patton was a man built for movement, for battle, for the roar of tanks and the smell of cordite. Now, he was surrounded by bureaucrats, policies, and a new kind of war, one waged in meeting rooms rather than on battlefields. He grew increasingly disillusioned with the very army he had served his entire life. He saw Soviet troops consolidating power in Eastern Europe, and he feared the Allies had traded one tyranny for another. "We defeated the wrong enemy," he allegedly remarked to his staff in early September 1945, a statement that would ignite controversy for decades. Whether taken out of context or not, it revealed a fracture in his faith in the post-war order. His officers, loyal but wary, watched as the general's fiery speeches began to sound more like warnings than leadership. To the public, Patton remained a hero, the man who liberated Bastogne, the man who slapped a soldier and later wept for it, the man whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of German generals. But to his superiors, especially General Dwight D. Eisenhower, he was becoming a liability. The United States Army could not afford rogue voices undermining the fragile diplomacy with Moscow, and Patton, never one to filter his words, seemed determined to challenge the very system he served. Diaries and field notes from his aides in late 1945 reveal a man torn between loyalty and outrage. Colonel Charles Codman wrote, "The general's moods are darkening. He speaks openly of betrayal, of a cause lost not to the Germans, but to politics." Even his wife, Beatrice, sensed the shift in his letters, a tone of exhaustion, tinged with bitterness. "Peace is worse than war," he confided to her. "At least in war, men are honest about what they want." The army's mission in Bavaria was not easy. Former Nazi administrators were required to be vetted or removed, yet Patton resisted wholesale purges. He argued that Germany needed administrators, engineers, and policemen to rebuild. His pragmatic stance was interpreted in Washington as sympathy for the enemy. The press seized on his comments. Headlines in the New York Times and Stars and Stripes began questioning whether the old blood and guts general had gone soft or gone mad. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower summoned him to explain his statements. The meeting, held in early October 1945, was tense. Eyewitnesses recalled Patton standing ramrod straight, refusing to back down. "I will not let America destroy itself in the name of vengeance," he reportedly said. Eisenhower listened but remained cold. By the end of the month, Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to the 15th Army, a position with no troops, no battles, and no real purpose. It was a bureaucratic exile. To his staff, the demotion felt like a betrayal. To Patton, it was the final humiliation. The man who had led the fastest armored advance in military history was now reduced to writing reports and supervising war records. He told his close friend, General Jeffrey Keyes, "They've taken away my army, my purpose, my reason to exist." Keyes tried to comfort him, but it was clear that Patton's spirit had been fractured. Yet beneath his bitterness, a new determination began to take shape. Patton believed he still had a mission, to tell the truth about what he saw unfolding in Europe. He feared the Soviets more than any remnant of the German Reich, and he suspected that American leadership was turning a blind eye to their growing aggression. In private correspondence, he wrote, "The next war is already upon us, and we do not even see it coming." As the cold winds swept across a defeated Germany, Patton's words carried the chill of prophecy. His staff noted that he spent long hours studying intelligence reports, writing memos critical of Allied decisions, and even speaking of resigning his commission to speak freely. For a man like Patton, silence was impossible, and in the tense aftermath of World War II, words could be as dangerous as bullets. By December, The once revered general stood isolated within the institution he had helped build. Admirers called him a patriot. Detractors whispered that he was losing control. His behavior grew unpredictable, his thoughts consumed by the feeling that he was being watched, recorded, and silenced. Whether paranoia or truth, the tension around him was palpable. And so, as 1945 drew to a close, the greatest armored commander of the war stood on the brink of an unseen battle. One not fought with tanks or troops, but with secrets, silence, and the shadow of power itself. The fall of 1945 brought more than just the first winter of peace. It brought a quiet, creeping war of politics, power, and distrust. General George S. Patton, once hailed as the savior of Europe, found himself increasingly isolated within the same military hierarchy he had helped make victorious. What began as outspoken frustration over post-war policy now evolved into open defiance, and his commanders in Washington grew uneasy. The war hero's voice, once essential to victory, had become a dangerous echo of dissent. Patton's reassignment to the 15th Army in Bad Nauheim was meant to be a silencing measure, a comfortable desk job cataloguing the history of the war. But to him, it was an insult. He was a warrior without a battlefield. As he wrote to his wife Beatrice on October 18, 1945, "I am being treated like a naughty child, sent to his room. They wish me to keep quiet. I cannot." The man who had driven tanks across France now spent his days reviewing casualty charts and after-action reports. Each file was another reminder of the war that defined him, and the peace that was slowly erasing him. Yet the general's words still carried power, and he knew it. In letters to his former staff officers and European correspondents, Patton spoke of corruption within the Allied occupation government. He accused bureaucrats of using denazification as a weapon for personal gain, replacing one form of tyranny with another. "We are turning Germany over to the communists," he told journalist Drew Pearson in an unguarded conversation that quickly reached Washington. His superiors were furious. Eisenhower, who had long protected Patton from his own mouth, finally warned that one more public outburst could end his career, but Patton's defiance only deepened. On October 22nd, during a press conference in Bad Nauheim, he criticized the policy of mass denazification, saying, "I'm not interested in the Nazi aspect. The Nazi Party was a political outfit, like a Democrat or Republican Party." To American ears still raw from the war, the statement was explosive. Newspapers seized upon it instantly. "Patton defends Nazis," screamed one headline in the New York Times. His words were stripped of nuance, reshaped into scandal, and sent across the Atlantic as proof that old blood and guts had lost his senses. Behind the headlines, however, the reality was more complex. Patton wasn't sympathizing with Nazis. He was warning against dismantling Germany so completely that it would fall into Soviet hands. In his view, America was punishing an entire people instead of rebuilding an ally. His belief that the true enemy was the Soviet Union was no secret. He spoke of it openly to his subordinates and even to visiting officers from London. "If we have to fight them," he said during a dinner at the Officers' Club in late October, "we'd better do it now, while we still have the guns here." Such remarks found their way into reports filed by Army intelligence. Some officers began to suspect that the general's phone lines and mail were being quietly monitored. His aides noticed men in plain clothes at meetings, unfamiliar faces in nearby cafes. Colonel Paul Harkins, one of Patton's closest aides, later recalled. The general said he was sure someone was watching him. He even laughed about it, but there was an edge in his voice. What began as whispers of paranoia started to resemble evidence of surveillance. Patton's situation worsened after Eisenhower ordered an internal review of his public statements. Rumors spread through the ranks that Washington was considering retiring him early. To some within the officer corps, the idea bordered on sacrilege, but others, especially those aligned with the new diplomatic order, saw it as necessary. "The war is over," General Omar Bradley told a reporter. "We can't have our commanders fighting the peace." Still, Patton's determination only hardened. On November 9, 1945, he wrote in his diary, "I have no intention of remaining silent. There is rot within our command, and I will not be party to it." He began drafting a letter of resignation, intending to leave the army and return home to speak freely about his views on the Soviets and the occupation. Friends urged him to reconsider, warning that such a move would end his career and isolate him politically. But Patton had already decided. He told one aide, "I've fought Germans. I can fight bureaucrats." By late November, the tone of his correspondence had shifted. There was something darker beneath the anger, a sense of foreboding. He wrote to Beatrice, "Something is amiss here. I can feel it. If anything happens to me, you must know it was not an accident." The line, long dismissed as melodramatic, would take on a haunting significance just weeks later. Meanwhile, the Allied command in Frankfurt grew increasingly frustrated. Reports of Patton's unapproved interviews, private meetings, and outspoken behavior reached the upper echelons daily. A final reprimand was prepared, and his request to return to the United States for the holidays was under review. His superiors hoped that distance would cool his temper. Instead, it would bring him closer to tragedy. On December 8, 1945, Patton decided to take a brief hunting trip near Mannheim with his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, a chance, he said, to clear his head before the journey home. His aides recalled him in unusually good spirits that morning, joking about his marksmanship and his plans to write a memoir once back in California. None of them could have imagined that within 24 hours, the most feared general of the war would be fighting for his life. The next morning, under a grey German sky, Patton's Cadillac staff car rolled north along a quiet road outside Mannheim, toward a moment that remains shrouded in questions to this day. It was a grey and misty morning on December 9, 1945. The fog hung low over the fields outside Mannheim, softening the scars of war that still marked the German countryside. General George S. Patton, seated in the back of his Cadillac staff car, seemed unusually calm. He and Major General Hobart Gay were heading out on a short hunting trip near Speyer, a momentary escape from the bureaucratic battles and political storms that had come to define his final months. The journey was routine, the road quiet. Yet within the hour, history would take a violent and inexplicable turn. The car, a black 1938 Cadillac Model 75, was driven by Technical Sergeant Horace Woodring, an experienced chauffeur who had served Patton throughout the war. The route was familiar. A straight stretch of the N2 highway running parallel to the Rhine, surrounded by farmland and patches of pine. At around 11:45 a.m., they passed through the village of Neckarstadt, heading toward a railway crossing just outside the city of Mannheim. The road was damp but clear. According to later testimony, a U.S. Army GMC truck driven by Private Robert L. Thompson was parked along the shoulder, loaded with wooden poles. As Patton's Cadillac approached, the truck suddenly turned left across the road, directly into the general's path. Woodring swerved hard, but there was no time. The two Army vehicles collided head-on at low speed. No more than 35 miles per hour, witnesses would later claim. To the soldiers nearby, it seemed like a minor crash. But inside the Cadillac, history shifted in an instant. Hobart Gay and Woodring walked away with only minor bruises. Patton, however, was thrown forward violently. Accounts differ on the exact cause, but it's believed his head struck the steel frame of the partition behind the driver's seat. The blow snapped his neck. He slumped back immediately, unable to move his arms or legs. His first words, according to Woodring, were chillingly calm. "I think I'm paralyzed." The general was rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, 40 miles away. Military doctors found a fracture of the third cervical vertebra, a break that left him quadriplegic, though conscious and lucid. Colonel Charles Callahan, one of the attending surgeons, later remarked that Patton faced his condition with more courage than any man I have ever seen. When asked how he felt, Patton replied, "This is a hell of a way to die." The official Army report was filed within hours. It described the event as a simple traffic accident, a tragic mishap caused by poor visibility. But from the start, there were inconsistencies. The truck driver, Private Thompson, was said to have been lightly injured and taken to a nearby medical station, yet no record of his treatment or later assignment has ever been found. In the official log, his name vanishes after that day. Journalists who later tried to trace him hit a wall of silence. Some claimed he was reassigned to the United States within days, others that he never existed at all. Adding to the strangeness, photographs of the crash scene disappeared from the Army archives. Investigators noted that the Cadillac bore surprisingly little damage. The front grille bent, the windshield cracked, but the passenger compartment intact. Given the slow speed and minor impact, the severity of Patton's injuries seemed inexplicable. As one officer later observed, it looked like a fender bender that killed a legend. Military police arrived within minutes, sealing the area and removing both vehicles. Civilians in the area were ordered away. According to one report from the Mannheim garrison, a group of local laborers who witnessed the crash were taken for questioning and released the next day. None were ever identified again in official documents. A German mechanic who worked at a nearby depot later told a journalist that he saw two unmarked jeeps arrive shortly after the crash and leave without explanation. Patton's wife, Beatrice, was notified that evening. She immediately arranged to travel to Germany, but by the time she reached his bedside in Heidelberg, the general had already undergone emergency stabilization. Despite his paralysis, he remained mentally sharp, speaking with the same directness that had defined him in life. "This is my end," he told his wife softly, "but I've done my duty." Yet even in those final days, he seemed haunted by the crash, by the politics that surrounded him, and perhaps by something more. Those closest to Patton noticed the unease among officers handling the case. Requests from US correspondents to visit the site or photograph the wrecked Cadillac were denied. When one photographer from Stars and Stripes managed to capture a few shots, his film was reportedly confiscated by military police. The official line, "A tragic accident," was delivered with unusual firmness, too firm, some said, for an event that should have been open and shut. In Washington, the War Department issued a brief statement. General George S. Patton, Jr. sustained serious injuries in an automobile accident in Germany. His condition is critical but stable. No further details were released. Rumors began to spread through military circles almost immediately. Some believed the crash was staged, that Patton's enemies, political or otherwise, had found a way to silence him before he could expose what he knew about the post-war power struggle. Others dismissed such theories as the inevitable mythology surrounding a fallen hero. Still, the questions refused to fade. Lying in his hospital bed, immobilized but alert, Patton asked to see the accident report. It was never brought to him. Instead, he was visited by a stream of senior officers, men who spoke carefully, as if measuring each word. To his aide, Paul Harkins, Patton murmured one night, "They've beaten me at last." Outside, the winter deepened. Snow fell quietly on Heidelberg, blanketing the ruins of a continent he had fought to save. Inside the hospital walls, America's most daring general faced an unseen enemy, not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of bureaucracy and power. The official story would remain unchanged, yet the truth, whatever it was, would haunt history for decades to come. The corridors of the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg were quiet that December. Beyond its red brick walls, Germany lay in ruins, a conquered nation under Allied occupation. Inside Room 1A, General George S. Patton, paralyzed from the neck down, lay staring at the ceiling. His once thunderous voice, the rallying cry of the US Third Army, now came in measured, deliberate words. The man who had driven tanks across Europe faster than any commander in history was now trapped in stillness. And yet, in that silence, a new kind of battle began, one of secrecy, control, and suspicion. Doctors and nurses kept detailed logs of his condition. Major General Albert Kenner, the Army's chief surgeon, described Patton as alert, talkative, and rational, but physically deteriorating. His spinal fracture was irreparable. Still, Patton defied medical expectations. "He never once complained," said Nurse Anna Brinkman, one of the few Germans allowed near him. But sometimes, when the room was quiet, I could see him staring out the window, his eyes full of fury. Within days of the accident, inconsistencies began to surface. The military police investigation was swift, too swift. The official report was filed within 48 hours, stating that poor visibility and driver error were to blame. But several officers questioned how such a low-speed collision could have resulted in such catastrophic injury. Colonel Paul Harkins, Patton's aide, was among them. "It didn't make sense," he later said. "The car was hardly damaged, yet the general's neck was broken clean through." Attempts to locate the truck driver, Private Robert L. Thompson, led nowhere. He had reportedly been treated for minor injuries at the Mannheim dispensary, but no record of his admission or discharge existed. His unit, the 818th Military Police Company, denied ever having a driver by that name. The vehicle itself, a US Army GMC CCKW-2 1.2-ton truck, was removed from the scene the same day and later scrapped. When Harkins requested to inspect the remains, he was told the vehicle had been disposed of for salvage. Meanwhile, Journalists from Stars and Stripes and Time magazine sought access to the crash site, only to be turned away by American sentries. A local German photographer who managed to take several pictures found his film confiscated by the military police. One surviving photo, smuggled out by a civilian worker, shows the Cadillac's front grille slightly dented and one headlight shattered. Hardly the wreckage of a fatal accident. Yet soon, even that photo disappeared from circulation. As rumors mounted, Army intelligence officers began interviewing anyone who had contact with Patton in the days prior to the crash. Several of his aides were reassigned without explanation. His longtime driver, Sergeant Woodring, was ordered not to speak to the press. "They told me to forget what I saw," he later told a friend. But how do you forget something like that? To the outside world, Patton's condition was reported as stable. Inside the hospital, however, he struggled daily against pneumonia, paralysis, and despair. Yet even in his weakened state, his mind remained sharp and defiant. He told his wife Beatrice, who arrived from the United States on December 11th, "I'll be up and around soon enough. Then I'll tell them all what's happening here." Beatrice later wrote in her journal that he was restless, convinced that someone wanted him silenced. His doctors tried to reassure him, but even they sensed the tension surrounding his case. Military visitors arrived frequently. Generals, diplomats, and officials from the Office of Military Government. Their conversations with Patton were private, their demeanor cautious. According to one nurse's recollection, whenever the higher-ups came, the guards outside doubled, and the room was cleared. The general's medical chart was kept under lock and key. Rumors reached the hospital staff that Patton had planned to retire upon returning to the US and publish a memoir critical of Allied policies toward the Soviets. He had reportedly been approached by journalist Frederick Ayer Jr., who encouraged him to speak publicly about his wartime experiences and post-war frustrations. The timing of the crash, just days before his planned departure, seemed too coincidental for some of his officers to ignore. There were also whispers of threats. A visiting aide recalled Patton saying, "I've been warned to keep quiet, but I've never been good at that." Those words, spoken barely a week before his death, were later omitted from official transcripts. His family was told not to discuss them publicly. The Army cited privacy concerns. By mid-December, Patton's condition worsened. He developed a pulmonary embolism, his breathing labored, his color pale. Yet even then, his defiance burned through. "I'd rather die a soldier than live in bed," he told his doctor. That evening, Beatrice found him restless and agitated. "They've won, Bea," he whispered. "They'll write what they want, and no one will ever know." Outside the hospital, the rumors refused to die. Local Germans whispered about a convoy of unmarked jeeps seen near the crash site that morning. A Mannheim mechanic claimed to have seen the Cadillac at a US motor pool days later, its damage inconsistent with the official report. Each new piece of information deepened the mystery, yet no formal reinvestigation was ever ordered. On December 20th, one day before his death, Patton seemed at peace. He thanked the nurses, spoke softly with Beatrice, and asked to look outside one last time. Snow was falling, thick, silent, and endless. "It's beautiful," he said. "I'd rather be out there with my men." At 5:55 p.m. on December 21st, 1945, General George S. Patton died in his sleep. The official cause, pulmonary edema and heart failure secondary to spinal trauma. The next day, his body was prepared for transport under heavy guard. No autopsy was performed. The Army said it was unnecessary. But as his coffin was sealed and the paperwork finalized, one question lingered in every whispering corridor. Was it truly an accident? Or had America's fiercest general been silenced before he could speak one last truth? The war was over, yet for those who had served under him, the battle for answers had only just begun. In the cold, sterile quiet of Heidelberg Hospital, the final days of General George S. Patton unfolded with the gravity of tragedy and the tension of conspiracy. By late December 1945, Europe was celebrating its first Christmas of peace. But within the Army's most guarded medical ward, America's most audacious general was slipping away. The man who had driven tanks across the continent, who had turned defeat into triumph, now lay motionless, watching the snow fall outside his window. What haunted him in those final hours was not pain, but a sense of unfinished purpose, and some believed, fear. Patton's room was under constant watch. 2 US Army guards stood outside the door at all times, and visitors were screened. Beatrice Patton, His devoted wife was allowed only brief intervals with him, accompanied by hospital staff. Even she remarked in her journal that her husband seemed surrounded by a wall of control. The doctor's notes were precise and clinical, yet the atmosphere around room 1A was heavy. The weight of command, secrecy, and the unspoken realization that something larger was being contained. Despite his paralysis, Patton's mind remained clear. He spoke often, sometimes angrily, about the state of the post-war world. "We're giving the Soviets everything we fought for," he told his doctor, Colonel Kenner. "We beat the wrong enemy, and the politicians don't even see it." He feared that America's alliance with Moscow had sowed the seeds of a new conflict. One fought not with tanks, but with deception and ideology. His aides noted that he wanted to go home to tell the truth, and that he was preparing to dictate notes for a memoir, but those plans would never leave Heidelberg. Beatrice later recalled that on the night of December 19th, her husband appeared uneasy. He had asked for his diary, a leather-bound notebook he had carried since the war, but it could not be found. When she inquired, hospital staff told her it had been misplaced among his effects. The diary would never be seen again. Years later, researchers combing military archives discovered a gap in Patton's personal papers covering the final 2 months of 1945, precisely the period when his frustrations with Allied leadership had reached their peak. Still, Patton's willpower remained iron. He received communion daily, and his humor surfaced even through the pain. When a nurse apologized for accidentally jostling his pillow, he quipped, "Don't worry, I've been hit harder by better people." But behind the jokes lay exhaustion and resignation. He confided to Beatrice, "I'm not afraid to die. I just hate to die without finishing the fight." The general's visitors grew fewer as the days went on. Major General Hobart Gay, who had been in the car with him during the crash, came only once, a brief visit marked by polite conversation and silence. Witnesses said both men seemed uneasy, their friendship shadowed by the questions no one dared ask. Colonel Paul Harkins, his loyal aide, was barred from visiting on December 20th due to medical orders. Instead, he waited in the hospital courtyard, chain-smoking, while snow blanketed the rooftops of Heidelberg. That same night, an officer from the Office of Military Government arrived to collect certain personal items from Patton's quarters, including letters, field notebooks, and correspondence. The officer's name does not appear in the hospital's visitor log. The items were never returned to the family. When Beatrice asked about them weeks later, she was told they had been sent to Washington for archival processing. No such shipment was ever confirmed. On the morning of December 21st, Patton seemed calm. His breathing was weak, but he was alert and lucid. He asked to look outside one final time. Nurse Brinkman drew back the curtain. Snowflakes drifted softly over the frozen courtyard. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "I'd rather be out there with my men." Hours later, at 5:55 p.m., General George S. Patton died quietly, Beatrice holding his hand. The official cause of death, recorded on the Army's report, was pulmonary embolism secondary to spinal fracture. No autopsy was performed. The decision, according to military doctors, was based on the clarity of cause. Yet in the weeks that followed, this absence of post-mortem examination fueled whispers that the Army wished to close the book quickly. Too quickly. "It was as if they wanted him buried before the questions began," one officer later said. Patton's funeral arrangements were handled with military precision. His body, placed in a plain coffin, was transported under guard to Luxembourg, where he was buried at the Ham American Cemetery. Among the men of the Third Army he had led to victory, the ceremony was small, dignified, and quiet. No band, no parade, no fanfare. A light snow fell as taps echoed across the field of white crosses. To his soldiers, it was not merely a farewell, but a silence that felt unnatural, as though their general's voice had been deliberately muted. In Washington, the press received a brief communiqué. "General George S. Patton has passed away following complications from injuries sustained in an automobile accident. He served his country with distinction." The headlines lasted one day. Then, almost as swiftly as he had risen, Patton vanished from the front pages. But those who had known him best, his aides, his officers, his friends, found the official story hard to accept. They questioned the missing truck driver, the vanished diary, the absence of autopsy, the sealed reports. Too many details had been buried alongside the man himself. As one of his former staff officers remarked years later, it wasn't the car crash that killed him, it was what he knew. For Beatrice, the grief was matched only by suspicion. In letters to friends, she wrote of forces that sought to quiet George's voice. She never elaborated publicly, but her actions spoke volumes. She refused to publish his final notes, saying simply, "Some truths aren't ready for the world yet." And so, with his coffin sealed beneath the snow of Luxembourg, the curtain fell on one of history's most complex figures. Yet the silence surrounding his death only deepened the mystery. The war hero who defied enemies on every front had been defeated not by a bullet or a battle, but by a moment of peace, and perhaps by secrets powerful enough to follow him even into death. In the decades that followed General George S. Patton's death, his legend refused to rest in peace. Officially, his passing was the result of a tragic accident, the kind of cruel irony that often befalls men of action. But among soldiers, historians, and intelligence officers, the story never sat comfortably. Too many questions lingered unanswered. A vanished truck driver, missing records, and a silenced general on the brink of revealing his deepest convictions. What began as a simple car crash became one of the most enduring mysteries of the Second World War's aftermath. In 1946, only months after Patton's burial at Ham American Cemetery in Luxembourg, whispers of conspiracy began circulating through military circles. Officers who had served under him couldn't reconcile the official report with the facts. They remembered the general as a man of extraordinary physical resilience, one who had survived plane crashes, ambushes, and frontline combat, yet was suddenly felled by a slow-speed accident on a quiet German road. "It didn't add up," said Colonel Paul Harkins years later. "The car was barely dented. The story was too neat." Journalists soon joined the search for truth. In the early 1950s, the Chicago Tribune and the London Express both published speculative pieces questioning the official version, but neither could access the classified army records concerning the accident or the subsequent investigation. Requests for the original accident file were repeatedly denied for national security reasons. When portions were finally declassified in the 1970s, they revealed pages missing, redacted sections marked "Restricted European Command." The gaps only deepened the intrigue. Rumors of assassination grew louder as Cold War tensions escalated. Patton's outspoken warnings about the Soviet Union, which had seemed extreme in 1945, were now prophetic. Declassified correspondence from the US military government showed that he had indeed drafted plans for a public statement criticizing Allied policy toward Moscow. He had even mentioned traveling to Washington to expose what's really happening in Europe. For those inclined to see patterns in shadows, it was enough to suggest motive. Some claimed that Patton's own allies wanted him silenced before he embarrassed the post-war command structure. Others whispered of Soviet involvement, that the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, might have had a hand in removing a general who saw the Cold War coming before anyone else did. None of these theories were ever proven, yet neither were they conclusively disproven. As historian Ladislas Farago noted in his 1971 biography, Patton, Ordeal and Triumph, the man who once lived for battle died amid politics, and politics leaves no fingerprints. One of the most striking accounts surfaced decades later. In the late 1990s, former OSS operative Douglas Bazata claimed in an interview that he had been approached by American intelligence to arrange an accident involving Patton. Bazata's claims, published in The Sunday Telegraph in 1979 and revisited years later, painted a picture of intrigue, a staged crash, a shot from a silenced weapon, and a cover story built overnight. Historians remain divided over his testimony. Some view it as credible, others as self-serving fiction. But the persistence of such stories reflects the magnitude of doubt surrounding Patton's final hours. Meanwhile, archival discoveries continued to fuel debate. In 2008, researcher Robert Wilcox published Target Patton, based on newly uncovered intelligence memos and interviews. The documents suggested that both US and Soviet officials considered Patton a threat to post-war stability due to his volatile independence. Wilcox's findings reignited public fascination, even prompting calls for a forensic reinvestigation of Patton's remains. Though the US Army firmly rejected such proposals, citing respect for the deceased and lack of new evidence. Through all the theories, one truth remained unshakable. Patton's voice had warned of the coming Cold War before anyone dared speak it. "We're going to have to fight the Russians sooner or later," he had told his staff in 1945. "Why not do it while we still have the army to do it with?" Within months of his death, Winston Churchill would echo similar fears in his Iron Curtain speech. It was as if Patton had seen the next war before the last one had ended. Today, Patton's grave lies at the front of the American cemetery in Ham, not by rank, but by his own request. "A general should be with his men," he once said. Rows of white crosses stretch behind him, marking the final resting place of soldiers who followed him across France, the Ardennes and the Rhine. Visitors leave flags, helmets and small stones upon his grave, each a quiet salute to a man who refused to bow to authority, even at the cost of his life. Whether his death was accident or assassination may never be known. The fragments of evidence, the vanished records, and the tight-lipped officials of 1945 have long since passed into history. Yet the mystery remains alive, not because of what may have been done to him, but because of what he stood for. Patton embodied a rare truth about power, that courage in war is simple compared to courage in peace. In the end, his legacy is not defined by his death, but by the unyielding fire of his convictions. "It is foolish and wrong," he once told his men, "to mourn the men who died. Rather, we should thank God that such men lived." For all the uncertainty that surrounds his final days, one certainty endures. George S. Patton lived as he fought, boldly, defiantly, and on his own terms. And perhaps that is the greatest truth behind his final mystery.